All right, good morning, everyone. So it's our distinct pleasure to introduce our visiting professor and speaker for the Smith Center Cardiology Grand Rounds this year. As people know, every year we have a cardiology Grand Rounds that we sponsor from the Smith Center. And it's always somebody that we think has really revolutionized the field and been someone who's been an inspiration for all of us. We usually have this talk in the spring. But last spring, after we were thinking about and planning for this year, a few of us had a chance to hear Dr. Califf speak. And he was talking about what we all thought was a really important issue. And he was talking about trust in medicine, in confidence in information that we were hearing. And we all thought that, this was an important talk for all of us and an important conversation for us to have, and that we ought to accelerate this and we ought to do this sometime in the fall. So we're here now. Dr. Califf really needs no introduction, but briefly, he is, among other things, the founding director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute and commissioner of the FDA under two different administrations, and now self-described chief provocateur, which I think is the most exciting of the titles. And we had a little laugh, instructor of medicine, when he went back to Duke after his roles in the FDA and years at Google as well. He came back and they made him start the process. So even at that level, you're not immune to having to go through the sort of administrative hoops. So his talk, Navigating the Tsunami of Cardiovascular Disease in Tumultuous Times. We're going to do something a little different. We're going to have him speak for half hour or so, and then we'll have a conversation. The conversation hopefully will involve all of us. We'll, create a little circle and have a conversation to be able to talk about these really important issues. Dr. Califf.
Thanks, Bobby. I have really admired the work that you've done, and all of you. I've been in various meetings, and this is a tremendous group that is having an impact, and I hope we'll have even a larger impact, which is why I want to get through my talk so I can learn from you about what should be done about this mess that we have created. And it's also a little bit of an odd one for me. I had a 45 to 50-minute talk, but after thinking about it, I've so much more enjoyed the back and forth that goes on. I'm going to race through the slides to create a picture, and then I really do want to hear what you think we should do about it, whether you disagree with my assessment of where we are. All right, let's see. Use the clicker. All right. Let me go back. Previous. And I apologize, the fonts in the transfer got a little, they now look like old-fashioned typing from a typewriter, but that's fine. Now, this is sort of my introductory spiel that I have to give. I've been a political appointee twice. I'm 74 years old. I'm not looking for a job. I'm not looking for an NIH grant. I can use words like disparity and inequity without worrying about what people are going to do to me, because they probably do something to me for other reasons than that. And I welcome disagreement, so feel free to disagree. This is an outline of what I have to say. If you want to sleep through the next 25 minutes, we are the worst of all large high-income countries in health outcomes by far. And this is not happening across the board. We know what the underlying factors are that are in play. But the problem is that the people that represent the underlying factors used to be invisible. We just took care of people that showed up in our clinics as doctors, but now we know who all of them are because we have digital representation of essentially 100% of the population. Then along comes MAHA, which has gained public acceptance of the idea that we have inferior outcomes. Many of you probably remember when Don Berwick could not get confirmed as HHS secretary or CMS head because he said U.S. has inferior outcomes. Well, now everybody says it on both sides of the aisle. And our biomedical establishment is focused on the part of health that has the least impact on health outcomes, functional status, and longevity. Prevention and primary care have been undervalued, and I will argue even worse than undervalued. And on top of all that, communication has changed under our feet. And the least prepared entities to deal with the way communication has changed are established institutions, including our healthcare institutions. That's my summary of where we currently are. And people keep asking, okay, this is depressing. What can I do about it? So this is my short list, and you may have a different short list, or you may think there's nothing that needs to be done about it. Number one on my list is do your primary job well. But I would add to that, in a place like this, the imperative to do what you're doing in this institute has never been greater. And I'll go through why that is. Talk about it. People are uncomfortable, I've learned, when it's talked about. And I didn't come up with a cheap provocateur title. That was actually an official title given to me by Manesh Patel when I unretired for the second time from Duke. And I think especially in this town right now, speaking out about the balance of professionalism and finance, and I'll show why I believe that's important. We need to directly address the deficit in primary care. It should be all of our business. And I'm not professing to know what to do with primary care, but if we spent 1/100th of the energy trying to figure that out as we have trying to figure out, as I learned how to build a bridge from Dana-Farber to this place, I'll bet we could figure it out. We all need to be in the business of protecting the public health system because it's being destroyed right in front of us as we speak. And we've got to address consumerism because most of what needs to be done is not in the purview of coming to a medical clinic. It's what people are doing every day in their habits. And then finally, I think the part that Bobby was interested in is how do we communicate? And so I'll go through that. This is really not a new thing for me. And before the pandemic, during the pandemic, I put out this article in circulation. It's just my version of it. All of you know the data about the onslaught of cardiovascular disease, and it's just representative of all the other chronic diseases that are consuming both low-income and high-income countries now in ways that will mean that for what goes on in this building, there will never be a shortage, never be a lack of need for people to provide the kind of care you're providing here. But I'm going to argue that we got to walk and chew gum at the same time. And if we don't, there's going to continue to be a heavy price paid for it. So I'm going to race through the data. None of you will see this as anything new, but it's just to paint a picture of what we're dealing with. If you go to the bottom left-hand corner here, you see in the 1970s, we sort of look like all other high-income countries with a reasonable life expectancy at a fairly reasonable cost. And then something happened over time. All the other countries migrated together, and the United States went a separate direction. That separate direction is what you would call a bad business deal. Pay twice as much for an inferior result. And it's not getting better. The gap is actually growing right now. This, of course, is not uniformly distributed. All of you know this. But I do think it's worth re-emphasizing that we still have the traditional disparities. They're still very much in play, even though most of you can't use that word. They are in play. But what's really become increasingly obvious is that this enormous wealth disparity that we have in this country is driving a lot of what's happening here, and so is education. And where you happen to live turns out to be an enormous factor in your health outcomes and the degree to which you're burdened with chronic disease. This is just a look from the Washington Post at where people are dying at a young age. It's not uniformly distributed. You could look at me and say, why are you coming here? Boston is not where the problem is. But as you well know, if you looked at Massachusetts and looked at 2 counties away from Boston, it looks pretty much like the rest of the country. And that's true everywhere you go. San Francisco, where I worked at Google, if you go to Lake County, 3 counties away, there's a 15-year difference in life expectancy. The one that has gotten my attention the most, and I think is really a core problem across the board, is that we're seeing the income gap, but also the accrued wealth gap growing at a very alarming rate. Who would have thought we would have a single individual worth over $300 billion? And I was talking with one of the billionaires whose wealth grew by 55 billion in the last quarter. Now, at the same time, half of Americans couldn't raise $5,000 to pay for a medical emergency. And so the health consequences are magnified in this wealth disparity that we're seeing in this country. And if you have a college degree right now, on average, you live 8 years longer than if you don't in this country. And you guys are the problem. Heart disease. We're in a Cardiovascular Institute, right? So the question is, what are we doing about it? Well, if we look at the patterns for heart disease, they look just like the others. And I guess one theme of all this that smart policy people need to be thinking about is the cardiologists are aggregated in places where the problem is not. And that's true of all medical specialists. Now, someone mentioned this last night, and I just, it's always now part of my talks because it's been brought up several times. I don't want to profess that this is all a matter of chronic disease. We have other special problems in this country, and I think this study by the AAMC is very important because half of this gap between us and other high-income countries would be fixed if we took care of guns, alcohol, and drug overdoses, which are not your primary problem, but I would argue that they're very much related to the underlying factors that I just went over. And of course, we are the worst in access to primary care of any of the high-income countries. And one thing that had a big impact on me is I got to know your colleague Atul Gawande when he was running AID while I was running FDA. You might say, what do they have to do with each other? And it turns out it's kind of interesting. If you go to low-income countries and you ask the question, should we purchase drugs which would not pass muster according to the FDA because there's no other alternative in this country, that's a hard decision that needs to be made in a combined way. So we intersected, but what he really got me going on was primary care, and his claim was that the reason that many middle-income countries now have longer life expectancy than the U.S. is that AID had a program of paying for primary care clinics in people's neighborhoods where they could stop by the clinic as they just walked around the neighborhood. And that had a huge impact on the management of the basic risk factors that are driving health outcomes. And what do Americans think about it? I'll bet that your health system, just like mine now that I'm back at Duke, advertises about how patient-centric it is. But I swear I cannot find a single human being who, if you ask them point blank, do you think your health system is patient-centric, who believes that that's true? And so 2/3 of Americans now, if asked the question, do I have to be responsible? I have to be responsible for my own health because no one else seems to care. 2/3 of Americans answer yes to that question. All right, now, just to make it even worse, a big change that I really perceive that it's not new, but it's at a fever pitch right now, is finances dominating over outcomes for patients. We're in a system that's a lot less than the sum of its parts. And I think a big reason, there's several big reasons for that in my view. One of them is that the system is purposely fragmented because people are making money off of the transactions that have to occur to go across the fragmentation. It's also suboptimized. That is, I'll bet that Dr. Gertzen is highly incented to make a margin in the heart component, and that people are not measuring the impact of things that he does on the rest of the system in a direct way. This is so obvious when you look at the way pharmacies are run in the U.S., and it was fascinating to me because I spent a lot of time with CMS this last time through to see that even at the level of HHS, the pharmacy component is regarded as like a separate thing. And it's very hard to get people to look at the impact of what happens if you have a good drug on downstream costs. And we also reward middle people in a way no other country does, in a very extreme way. Then the last part, which has been in several recent articles, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, but reflecting on my time on the executive committee of the Duke Health System, the value of most of our health systems now is almost a real estate play and an investment play more than it is a clinical operations play. Because if you look at the total value, so much of it is embedded in endowments and funds that are invested, and the real estate is enormously valuable. And these are 4 articles. I'll make the whole slide set available if people want to look at it. You may not be interested after this, but these are 4 articles that I would recommend reading. The last one on the money has become the mission is a very recent one in Lancet that I thought raised a lot of interesting points. And it had some great graphs, by the way, of administrators versus clinicians and how that's playing out in terms of who's being hired in our health systems. Well, so we have this problem, and then now it's being fueled with a massive amount of misinformation. I think all of you are probably aware of the basic nomenclature that we have misinformation, which is false information that's unintentional in one sense. Disinformation is misinformation that's intentional, and malinformation is misinformation that's purposeful to hurt people. And there's a big argument going on right now in the information ecosystem world about how much of the malinformation is coming from Chinese and Russian bots, with a very much listening to the public, finding issues that divide us, and then revving them up in social media in a way that only bots can do. I had a chance to talk a bit with Lisa last night, and I got to say, I think Lisa's listening in. I was so disappointed because I read everything that she writes. It's phenomenal. And she's in the middle of this primary care, I guess 5 articles. And I was sure she had the answer at the end of the 5 articles. She said she has no idea what to do. That was the final comment. But I thought this exchange really exemplifies what's happening even at the highest levels of wealth, where people have access to the best experts. This conversation between Mark Zuckerberg and Joe Rogan, where basically Zuck didn't get his platelet infusion. Now, I used to study platelet infusions because it drove me crazy that people were charging money for platelet-rich plasma. And also the peptides. These peptides are drugs which are being delivered into people, but they're not advertised as drugs, so they're not under FDA regulation. No one knows what they do. And this quote, I don't know, Zuckerberg says, I just took my doctor's advice. That's probably what you all would all hope that people would do. And Rogan says, don't do that anymore. I mean, next time there's other people to talk to. That's what's going on, and it's very purposeful. And I thought this is a good way to think about so-called Brandolini's law, the BS asymmetry principle. If you're going to say that vaccines rewrite your DNA, you can just say it. It was fascinating to me when I worked at Google. There were 10 products that had over 1 billion users per month. So the time and the cost of going viral on the internet is practically zero if you're lying. But if you want to tell the truth, you've actually got to work through how true is it? What are the probabilities? How would you explain it? It takes time. And so there's this quote that I like to use from Yuval Harari that says, truth is a rare and expensive kind of information. If you look at the total universe of information on the internet, most of it is pure opinion or unreliable information. The little bit that's true is hard to find and hard for the public to distinguish. So the way to remember it is that truth is typically behind the firewall. Lies are free. And That is a very unfair advantage for the truth. And the result of this is that we're seeing a decline in respect and trust, not just in federal agencies, but also in you, in the health systems that you work in. And if you go back to what I showed at the beginning, where people are saying, I can't even get an appointment. Even faculty members, families can't get appointments now. And then you say, why don't they trust us? That seems like it's pretty obvious. If you're not acting trustworthy, why should you be trusted? Okay, so we've created a mess. And I have a lot more supporting slides about the information part that if you have questions or comments, I'm glad to bring them up. So people ask what to do. I still think job number one is to do the job you're doing well. So I'm not arguing that you should, quit rounding in the intensive care unit and go out on the streets and provide free care. I think no matter what we do, and I had a real lesson. I was in Ireland 2 weeks ago playing golf, but also being inducted into the Irish Royal Academy of Medicine, which was quite a ceremony. But the life expectancy in Ireland is now 84. They've done a really good job of primary prevention. The biggest move was to outlaw smoking in the pubs, as you probably know. But their medical establishments are completely overwhelmed, despite the fact that they're doing a good job with prevention, because ultimately you get sick and die. And if you look at the numbers and the stats, there's just going to be an overwhelming amount of chronic disease and heart disease in this country, no matter what we do. You guys still need to be busy and do a good job. But also argue we got to get serious about evidence generation, because the technology is moving so much faster than the evidence that we can generate. And we're spending $5 trillion for an inferior result. So there's enough money in the system to do what needs to be done. We're obviously misallocating the money. And a real lesson, let's see if I kept this. Yeah, a real lesson is shown here. I got so tired of being FDA commissioner people saying, why doesn't the FDA require more of companies to get on the market? And the answer is because the FDA is just a referee in a game that's played with a set of rules that are made by Congress and the executive branch of the U.S. government. And what the rules say for drugs and devices is you need evidence in the view of experts in the field based on adequate and well-controlled studies that the benefits outweigh the risk for one population for some defined period of time. There's nothing else that is required. You don't even have to have the right dose. It's just a dose which empirically is shown to work. You don't have to know if it's better than anything else. You don't have to know how to combine it, how long to give it, or what its value is. We then toss it over this transom at the end of phase 3, where unless it's an accelerated approval, and there's a lot to discuss there, the FDA has really no purview over what studies are done. This area post-approval is your business. It's the practice of medicine. And it is really bothersome to me that we're continuing to throw technologies onto the market, and you all don't have the discipline to do the studies that are needed to figure out what to use. You just keep spending more and more money with the result that I've shown you. Trying to get you revved up here for the discussion part. But the payers are even worse. And I had this great session with the payers right when I came back to FDA. They asked me to speak at the AHIP meeting, which is where they all get together and talk about their payer stuff. And I thought it was just going to be a nice discussion, but it turned out it was an ambush because they were pissed off that the accelerated approval follow-up studies weren't being done fast enough, and they're having to pay for these very expensive rare disease drugs. Great, I need that. Having to pay for these expensive rare disease drugs. But I got a tip off in the green room before going out, and I was ready because getting ready for the meeting, I talked to a lot of my colleagues in practice. I started out by saying, what's the number one factor in the studies not getting done? And the answer that I gave was, I hear from 100% of my clinical colleagues that you're not supporting it, and they can't do the studies unless insurance plays in the game. And that led to a whole set of discussions. They said they were going to do something about it. They're not. somehow in this mix on the right-hand side of phase 3, we've got to redo this in this country if we're going to work our way out of it. All right, this one I've already talked about, but I got Gemini help here. And if you just look at the values of medicine as a profession on the lower left compared to medicine as a business on the lower right, that's what's in play. And I just think of it as a scale. I'm working on some graphics now on this stuff, but right now finance is way up here in the discussion and professionalism is way down here, so much that my thesis with the Greenwald Foundation next month in the sort of the ethics lecture they asked me to give is that ethics is considered irrelevant by those who run healthcare systems. It's just never discussed. And it's something that unless you speak up, it's not going to happen. It's going to take courage and people who are willing. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be concerned about finance. We have to balance these two things, but they're way out of balance right now in our system. Primary care is essential. And although Lisa did not figure it out in a whole year, writing 5 articles, I'm pissed off about that. I don't know how you can argue that this is not absolutely critical. And I think it's actually at the core of why you're losing the trust of the people who live, let's say, in rural Massachusetts. They see you driving fancy cars in these big buildings that look like the Ritz-Carlton. They can't get an appointment. It's just not the way it needs to be. Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but I think there are a good list of things that we need to try. And I would argue that if people in a place like this put as much energy into figuring this out as they do into other things, that it's a solvable problem, probably involving a combination of clinical teams, not just doctors, with AI that facilitates the work and is not purely intended to extract more money by upcoding, which is happening on an amazingly large scale right now as we speak. But equal with that, and this was the hot topic at dinner last night, and I want to tell you, it was already in my slides. I didn't make any new slides for this. But we got to preserve the public health system. I mean, the core of all this is these very basic things. And I'm involved right now with a lot of people who are doing startups with a lot of funding on AI or precision prevention, with the idea that the problem is we're not doing enough genomics and fancy testing to figure out exactly who it is who's at risk to develop heart disease 20 years later. I'm actually working with that because it's a lot of fun and it's very interesting. But I have to remind them that at the base of this, if we just put people on statins who had high LDL and use generic blood pressure medicines and get ready for generic anti-obesity medicines and put clinics in neighborhoods and emphasize to people constantly they should walk, that would take care of a very large proportion of the gap we have in health outcomes. And that's not going to change until we have very fundamental change in who we elect, because laws have to be at the basis of this. But we can make incremental progress in the meanwhile. Because I'm very involved in trying to grapple with what's happening to the public health component of the U.S. government right now, I do want to point out to you that Massachusetts is playing a key role. And this is something I think you should really support. And I remember having a discussion with Gavin Newsom. I was out in California because of the H5N1 epidemic right after the election. And I said, Governor, this is important, but if you don't get the governors together of people who understand what these issues are, you're not going to be able to depend on the federal government to do the work. And so this new coalition that was just announced, I think it's absolutely critical that you set the standard for what public health should look like. And I think it can be quite powerful. This just came out in the Lancet, and I show this just to emphasize that I agree that this base of primordial prevention with public health measures that require laws to be passed, and I'm going to argue require a different mode of communication, is really the core. But I also don't think that it's fair to dismiss primary care as an issue, which seems to be what your health systems in Boston are doing, are saying it's somebody else's problem. And I think that's scandalous, actually, and I hope that someone speaks up against it. All right, we got to make basic health habits popular. That's really at the core of this. And I think the American Heart got it right. And it's fascinating. The more I get involved now in fancy testing for long-term outcomes, the more all these chronic diseases look like they have a lot of common intersecting pathways. And it all comes back to these really basic, fundamental 8 things. It's not rocket science, as they say. These are things that we can do. And I want to very highly recommend this book if you have not yet had a chance to read it. Kevin Hall is a physics person who got interested in metabolism and so started studying nutrition, ended up at NIH and did really the definitive studies on ultra-processed food and its impact on the appetite. Then he went further into the topic, and RFK loved him because of the ultra-processed food. But when he went further, it turns out it's not so simple. It's not just ultra-processing. It actually does go back to the basics of salt, sugar, and saturated fat. That did not go over well with RFK. So if you read it, Kevin's letter when he resigned from NIH, basically he was censored and not allowed to put out the message from the studies that he had done. But this book, I think, really lays it out there. I've gotten to know Kevin well. It really lays it out there. And the basic message is if you've bought any book about a diet, you've wasted your money. And that no matter what you do, if you go on any diet, most people are going to lose weight and then they're going to gain it back, because what's really important is the combination of the food environment that you're in, which an individual can't change easily, especially if they're low income, and these nasty gut hormones that are telling your brain what your saturation point is for eating. And so highly recommend this book. All right, almost done. We got to guide AI into health improvement in balance with financial objectives. The main use of AI in healthcare today is to extract money from people. It's a great way to tell who can pay and who can't. I remind people this is something that used to exist called a library. You all know this, but we're entering the era where all the information that a patient needs or that you need is going to be on the same cell phone, as competing companies are really working now on the next up-to-date, which is already coming out. I was really interested by Microsoft's announcement a couple of days ago about what they're doing with Copilot now to foster discussions between clinicians and patients and among patients using the large language model to inform the discussions. But these models are going to go off the rails unless we validate them in the situation in which they're being used. And so all health systems need to be able to do outcomes research. You guys are key to this. And I'm sure you all know the general dictum of clinical research that the most important information is always in the people who are lost to follow-up. We still in this country, as far as I know, don't have a single health system who can tell you who's dead and who's alive in their health system. You can guess it, and you can get it in retrospect later. But if you're going to validate models, you've got to have the information about the people who have the content for the health outcomes. But of course, the key thing here is that presumes that you're validating with a dependent variable, including health outcomes. If the dependent variable is financial margin, you actually don't care who's dead and alive. You care who's paying bills. And a person who's lost to follow-up is a person who's not paying the bills. So that's a marker in your analysis. So I think you have a battle to fight here right now to make sure your health system is measuring what it needs to measure to use AI appropriately. And I won't go into this detail, but I've come to the view that we need to regulate AI the same way we regulate food for safety, not food for nutrition. That's a whole other issue that has been a national failure, but our food is pretty safe. And it's not because there's an FDA inspector on every farm every day monitoring what's going on. It's because we have 10 fundamental principles that have been agreed upon, instantiated into law, And whether you're a farm, a grocery store, a distribution center, or a restaurant, you have to abide by those 10 principles. They're not specific saying do A, B, and C. There are principles about what you should do. Like if you're growing lettuce on a farm and there's an uphill upstream farm where there are cows, you need to do something different than if there's not. Otherwise, you're going to have contaminated lettuce. That's called the water rule. But we have not agreed on those principles. And if one of the principles was that health outcomes has to be a measure in the assessment of AI, this whole thing would change quite a bit. I don't see this happening in the near future, but I hope people like you will be arguing for it. And then finally, fight the good fight in the information ecosystem. These are 4 books I would highly recommend. The Science Under Siege is a little bit over the top political, I think, but it's worth reading because it's written by people who have been persecuted by people that have physically threatened them. And this is this small amount of reliable, truthful information. This is from Francis Collins' book. I would highly recommend that one. It's easy to read and has a lot of useful, practical information in it. And the goal should be to identify that information that's in the center of the ring and make sure that that's repeated over and over and over. And it's pretty simple stuff. For how to do this, I would recommend this article that just came out by Renee DiResta, who's a person that lost her job and her whole institute was defunded at Stanford because of she was vilified by the right wing. But it goes through the change that has occurred. On the one hand, we have constant 24/7 misinformation being promulgated, often to sell something different than what you're offering. I mean, one that's really bad right now is don't take chemotherapy for cancer. You can use saunas and other holistic techniques to treat your cancer. And what we're doing in response is to put out advertisements that we're patient-centered, which people know is not true, and to write journal articles. That's not a fair competition. And so I think the question is, how do we change the orientation of our institutions and our profession so that we're federated, giving consistent messages and listening to what the public is concerned about? And I've had a lot of fun over the last few months working with a group of students at a number of institutions. I've lost confidence that the leaders of institutions are going to take this on. So the students always have some hope. You can always hope they'll fix the things that we broke. And one observation they've made as we worked on this is we talked to clinicians in most places, and I suspect it's different here because you're all in one building, but there are a lot of isolated clinicians out there who are going to clinic. Their conferences are on Zoom. They're not interacting with colleagues in the same way. And they're sort of on their own out there, not feeling highly connected to a system. And so we're proposing a method to do this. We'll see if it works. This will be student-driven. And the concept is that people living out there are constantly exposed to poor, conflicting health information online, and the medical community struggles to present a unified, accessible guidance. It just doesn't. There's limited consensus and inconsistent communication, even among ourselves. And we don't characterize how we disagree in a way which the public can absorb. My philosophy of ICU care was you had to make a decision whether you had all the information or not. Sometimes you were 100% sure it was the right decision. Sometimes you were 51% sure. But not making a decision is making a decision. In public policy, it's the same thing. But I think a mistake in the pandemic was not characterizing the degree of agreement or disagreement about major policy decisions. You still had to make them because people were dying. And so the idea is not to just have people doing their own research, but put out consistent messages that allow them to do that. And we're now in an era where the wellness industry is getting bigger than the established medical industry in many areas. People are selling all kinds of stuff on the internet in preference to what you're offering. And so the great hope would be, you say, how can one place deal with 320 million Americans? That was my problem at the FDA. The answer is it can't. But we do have 600,000 students if you combine pharmacy, PAs, NPs, medical students, PhDs, and postdocs in biomedical sciences. 600,000 every year and 17 million health professionals now. And we got to change the way that we interact with them. So last couple of slides. We're currently in an era where Health and Human Services is using what I call policy-based, evidence-based, policy-based evidence. RFK decides the answer. Scientists are dispatched. If they bring back an answer he doesn't like, they're fired. It's pretty simple. What we need is the opposite, and we're going to have to really stand up for that to be the case. That also includes the fact that what we currently believe could be wrong in a lot of places. And we have to have the courage to take that on. So finally, what do? Everything I've talked about up to now has been incremental. But right after the election, I had read Project 2025, and I would argue that what's happened since then has been pretty well laid out in Project 2025. But I think the outcome of this is likely to be a pretty significant collapse of the system that we're in, because if more people start dying and we have a bad triple-demic, for example, we're just in no way prepared to deal with it. RFH5N1 takes off. There are 100 ways this could happen. And so I put out Humpty Dumpty as the analogy after the election, and I'm sticking with it. And the moral lesson here is people who remember Humpty Dumpty, it only had one verse when it started. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But the teachers of the world got together and said, we can't teach young kids that you could never put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So the woke teachers of the world made a longer version, in which the last version, they actually do put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I think the question for everyone right now is, as the system becomes more fragmented, less capable of delivering what people need, and the measurable outcomes become worse, who's going to have the know-how and the courage to put the system back together again? Not the way it was, because I could also give an hour-long lecture on all the problems that were so obvious when I was trying to run the FDA in the context of the American health system. But in some way, that's different than where we're headed now, but also different than the way it was. So I'll stop there, and let's have a discussion about how you all are going to fix this mess. I'm also open to any questions or bars. I've been through 2 Senate confirmations.
So nothing before lecture is going to be.
Sure. Okay. Well, we're majority. I could. Fabulous, absolutely fabulous lecture. I think one of the points you've gotten is that insurance companies and others are not paying for the research that we need to understand financial situation of what the cost effectiveness of their therapies are. How do we get there closer to that as a country when NIH is expressed as prohibited from looking at therapies that are less expensive?
Well, when you say expressly prohibited, are you talking about? Are you talking about?
The idea that somehow healthcare could be rationalized, or rationed before, and that's extrapolated into what is.
Okay, so that's not a law. That's a policy that it's just dependent on who's running the system. So, what I'd say to that is we need to elect different people, and it won't change until that happens. But incrementally, you live in a system. What's the budget of BI? It's in the billions. And I didn't have time to go into it, but you know about this, that EHR systems are evolving rapidly after years of complaining about how bad they are. They're still terrible, but they're I think really in a rapid phase of getting better, largely because of what large language models will ultimately do. And with a few adjustments like knowing who's dead and alive, the system of getting answers could be very inexpensive. And there is no law that says NIH can't study this. That's just a matter of who's running the NIH and what their beliefs are. In the past, I think this is all tied up in the fact that we couldn't see all the people who are being left out and not treated well until pretty recently. So there was a view that, well, once a product is on the market, that's up to industry to figure out and doctors to figure out through some magic way that I could never really understand how. Because most of the clinical trials I did got the opposite of the answer that people expected because they were typically not easy questions. So I think within the system, you all need to cause some good trouble. I mean, what is BI doing to move this along? I'll just point to one thing that I think is a sentinel event, and that was the vaccine studies that Denmark just did. 300,000 people per trial. It costed almost nothing. They did consent asynchronously through email. The vaccine, the 2 doses of vaccine were given, but people were going to get vaccinated anyway, and they used EHR data to measure the outcomes. And of course, they have the National Patient Identifier, which makes it a lot easier. Wow.
I have a question about costs and investigation, research, NIH funded research. There's a lot of discussion of indirect fraud. So what do you think can be done there? As an investigator, I feel that I know where that money is. You think that there needs to be.
Yeah, I could argue all sides of this because I've been on all sides. I've been in the administration defending the indirect costs, but I was once a young investigator. Now I'm a young investigator again. Here's what I think. I think that the new proposals from the universities that's pretty good. It's a step in the right direction. I will say, I've been in pharma, big tech, biotech, and device industries. If you look at what their indirect, if you looked at it the same way universities do, their indirect costs are higher than universities. The way to think about it, just look at the cost per FTE in the industry. It's higher than the cost per FTE in a university. And there's also this issue that we need a standing reserve, which is how this all started in the first place after World War II. We actually really need a standing reserve. That's being disassembled right now as we speak, both in government and out of government. I find that scary. So I think a little less indirect and more direct. I mean, part of the thing in industry is what you call direct and indirect is different. I think that would be good, and more transparency would be good. And then go at it. But I don't think the initial administration proposal is anywhere near correct for the reasons that I gave.
Quick question. So you touched on 3 themes, or more than 3 themes, but the 3 that resonated with me were, 1, the inequality problem, with the U.S. having a very high Gini coefficient, and as a nation tending to redistribute resources less through taxes and transfers than other OECD countries. And then there's the health system problem that ranges from structure, design to incentives and financialization. Then there's the sort of public health problem where we're losing trust, and agencies are sort of susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. So my question is, we think about the downstream things, the health system, the way health systems are designed, the way payers are incentivized, the way health systems are incentivized, and the public health stuff. How much of that do you think fixing that can make a dent in improving health outcomes when we're not addressing the inequality problem?
Well, we got into this a little bit last night. I would just say that you can't, in my view, you can't really dissociate the two. If you look at most places in the U.S., the health systems now are the largest employers by far, and the university systems. If you look at Alabama as an example, where I once spent a good bit of time, it's like 1 out of every 4 employed people in Alabama is employed by the university system, and the biggest employer there is the health system. I once tried to go to Pitt because Pitt had this enormous health system that was dominant as an employer, but it was under the condition that they allocate a big budget to employee health in a way that we described, and they decided to go to precision medicine instead as their priority. So that was okay. I learned a lot in that. But I think if we fix the fundamental health system problem, it would have a big effect on the people's environment. I mean, all of our employees are living in the same, and health systems are living in the same environment as everybody else. And we're just not emphasizing it at all. What if messages from health systems were about things that made you healthy and they were given in a way that had an impact? I mean, another example that had a huge effect on me, it almost killed me, actually. I was, right before I came to FDA, the most powerful communication in the history of the FDA came out. It was a tweet that said, "Don't be a horse, don't be a cow, don't take ivermectin," and had a picture of a farmer and a cow. It was a meme. It went viral. It had an enormous impact. But a group of medical freedom doctors took us to court, and the court said that it was illegal to have that tweet out, that the FDA should only put out factual information. Well, I just spent 6 years at Google learning that the way you influence people is, if you want to not influence people, put out tables and press releases. They're being influenced by constant memes and input into the addictive doom scrolling that everybody's doing now.
That Lisa's also online. I know that she's been listening in, and she got a couple shout outs by Dr. Califf. So I wanted to see, Lisa, if you have any, not to put you on the spot, but any questions or comments. Can we hear her?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Yay. I'm so sorry, I'm in transit. But Dr. Califf, I love listening to you talk. And I guess I'm curious what you think we should do about primary care. Because I'll tell you why I'm stuck. I'm stuck because for 25 years, in 1996, the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering wrote a report essentially saying we need more money to fund primary care. And then they were recommissioned in 2021 to do the exact same thing because nobody listened. And so I think where I'm stuck with it is that everybody knows for it to be sustainable, we need to increase its funding. And I don't know then where the disconnect lies. And so I'm so curious what you think. I think, as we talked about last night, there's a values problem. We seem not to value primary care, but what I don't know is how to change people's values.
Leadership. Where are the leaders? The Singaporeans put this in perspective for me the last time we were at a retreat in Utah. Don't feel sorry for me, but it's like American health policy people, and the Singaporeans were there just as part of the group. And what they said was, we have a set of problems in Singapore. We've identified them. We're specifically addressing the problems as a matter of national policy. They said, you have a set of problems that are destroying the health of your people, and your smartest people are working on something else. And why is that? Well, you could say, it just happens that way. No, I think leaders, and I want to, repeat, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I see no drop in the need for LVADs and percutaneous coronary intervention, and I love that stuff as a cardiologist. And I think out of $5 trillion, we could probably stop doing a lot of stuff that's useless and put that money into primary care. Now, exactly what to do once you did that, I don't know. I think we do have as I said, I think almost everyone agrees the outline is basically can't be just doctors. It's got to be clinical teams. They need to be in where people live. You've got to drive 2.5 hours to see a cardiologist. You shouldn't have to drive 2.5 hours to see a primary care person. And AI can really help if we orient the AI towards patient outcomes, which is not what's happening right now. So to me, it's all a matter of leadership, and it's uncomfortable. I was on the board of trustees of the ACC 25 years ago. Job number one at the American College of Cardiology is to protect the income of cardiologists. Maybe we need to think a little differently. You know, it's easy for me to say at age 74, I've already made my money, but I think leadership is what's needed.
Thank you.
Dr. Califf, when you think about the health system, it can get very overwhelming because there are so many things broken. And part of it is that our incentives are all misaligned. Like you described, there are so many people making money out of the broken system. I'm wondering if, as a starting point, there are opportunities where we are aligned. Are there some easy wins that we can think about in the health system that would make reform better? And an example to me is like, for both the Democrats and Republicans agree on drug prices, and we've made progress on drug prices, or appear to be making progress on drug prices. Are there other things like that, either on the regulatory side or within the health system, that jump out at you?
Yeah, first let me go back a second. When I said leadership, I mean people like Lisa actually writing not just a good article she's writing, but maybe whatever she believes should be done, say it bluntly, so that it has a maximum impact. A lot of people read your stuff, Lisa. So I think you're more optimistic about drug prices than I am. I see drug prices as an artifact of deception and pointing people towards a boogeyman that has problems. And I'm not opposed for innovator drugs having a rational system of payment. I'm all for that. But you would think when people discuss it that drug prices are the problem with the cost of American healthcare. They're a small part of the problem. Yeah, and so I think an example that I'm really stuck on is what's happening right now with TAVR, of all things. We have all these people sitting in nursing homes not getting TAVRs who would be helped if someone just had a system that got them to the right place at the right time. So I love this project at Columbia of AI applied to the 12-lead ECG and referral for echo without having to go through all the referral steps. It's just a simple example where a highly effective procedure, where I would recommend spending the money because it has such an impact, should be automated and done more and more. And the things that aren't so impactful, we should sort of also do those less and less. And I hate that insurance companies are the people that have to say that. What if health systems did that? We used to have, back in my heyday, we had a 2x2 table of profit of DRGs and procedures and benefit of DRGs and procedures. And you wanted to be in the upper right-hand corner, profitable and beneficial. But there were a lot of things in the upper left-hand corner. They were profitable, but not very beneficial. What people are being told now everywhere I go is, forget that other part of the dimension. Just keep the list of what's profitable and do more of that. And from a financial perspective, that makes sense. The one other example I'll give that I hope it goes this way, Mike Musalem, who ran Boston Scientific, which one did he run? Edwards, yeah. He's given his fortune now to congenital heart disease. I'm sensitive to that because we have a daughter with congenital heart disease who's done well. But if you think about that as a model, it's about 1% of kids are born with congenital heart disease. Most of them are not serious. I mean, they're easily dealt with. They're all serious, but a significant percentage are serious. And yet we still have a system where whether a kid ends up in the right place is an artifact of some Byzantine system. Yet every one of those kids has an echo now. We know who they are. And so I'm hoping that the money gets spent creating a rational system of referrals so that kids with congenital heart disease get to the right place for the care they need. And you can expand that now to adult congenital, which, is like a whole new frontier. But if we can get some examples like that, it will at least help. And that's why I say it's incremental, because to really fix it, we need to shatter Humpty Dumpty and then put him back together again. Yeah, as I'm working with a lot of people trying to do startups in AI and healthcare, I'm glad to see all of you actually see patients, because I was starting to think the purpose of the Harvard system was to educate people so that they could go immediately into hedge funds and venture capital. So even worse than, okay. But no, I'm shamelessly going to promote my Substack here, and I would urge you to look at it. And the thing I showed with the medical students, we're incorporating into a not-for-profit, because I really think there needs to be a virality to the communication about this among the students, because I think faculty and leaders are disturbed about this, but they don't know what to do. And I think it's going to take a connectedness that all the young people are used to now. My favorite question in medical meetings now is, how many of you know who Mr. Beast is? Well, some here do know. Mr. Beast has 340 million followers. So anything that Mr. Beast says about prevention, a lot of people are going to do it just because it's Mr. Beast. And so your influence now is not so much because you're an expert, it's because of how you reach people who are looking at fragmented, algorithmically driven media. So I think there's got to be a communication system among the students. And what I'm finding is that the most threatened people now are postdocs and PhDs in biomedical science, because all the programs are downsizing. It's really hard to get a job now. And just a very base, we have a secretary of HHS who doesn't believe that viruses cause disease. It's kind of hard to see a future in science when that's the case. So we need a voice that's giving the opposite view that's powerful. And, last thing I'll say is, I had a lot of reasons to go to Google. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, but one of the two things I wanted to learn first was, could you reverse engineer addiction to doom scrolling driven addiction? And the answer is no. Can't reverse engineer it. Fortunately, GLP-1 drugs actually do that. That's going to give us the key as to what to do. The second thing is, I wanted to know the secrets of advertising. That is an amazing advertising machine. And it turns out the biggest secret of advertising is something we all know. If you just say the same thing over and over and over and over, a lot of people are going to believe it, whether it's true or not. So if lies are being said over and over and over and over, and truth is being told once, or in a clinic for 10 minutes while a person is typing into a computer, it's pretty easy to say who's going to win. So we've got to say the truth over and over and over and over. And there's no system to do that now. And the great thing is, it doesn't cost anything to do it once you've systematically gotten to the truth. That's a great thing about this whole thing, if we can figure out how to put it together. So I hope there'll be we're calling this organization Aletheia, which is the Greek goddess of truth. We'll see. Most things fail, but we're going to give it a shot. So thanks.
Thanks so much.